Welcome to the March 8th edition of our BEEc Associates Speaker Series. Today we'll be having a presentation from Shelby Gibson, a PhD candidate in Shelia Colla's lab. We recognize that many Indigenous nations have long-standing relationships with the territories upon which York University campuses are located that precede the establishment of York University. York University acknowledges its presence on the traditional territories of many Indigenous nations. The area known as Takaranto has been caretaken by the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Huron-Wendat, and the Métis. It is now home to many Indigenous peoples. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. This territory is subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. If you're interested in learning more or exploring different areas of Indigenous land, I invite you to visit www.native-land.ca and check out different areas such as where your specimens are collected, where you complete research, where you live, anything really. It's global. So today's presentation will be given to us by Shelby. Shelby is a PhD candidate in the Colla lab at York University, studying pollination of culturally significant food and medicine plants. Shelby completed a Master's of Environmental Studies at York University and a Bachelor of Science Biology at Trent University. Shelby's previous research has focused on pollinator distribution and ecology in Ontario. So with that, I'd like us to all welcome Shelby, who will be giving her presentation.
Thank you, Laura, for the introduction. As Laura said, my name is Shelby Gibson. I'm a PhD candidate at York University in Shelia Colla's lab. I am planning on finishing this semester, so my talk is kind of a wrap-up of everything that I've done during my PhD work. And so my title is Plant-pollinator Relationships of Culturally Significant Food and Medicine Plants in the Great Lakes region. And my research is part of a larger project going on at York University called the Finding Flowers Project. This is an interdisciplinary research project co-led by professors Shelia Colla and Lisa Myers. It's a biocultural conservation project considering the relations between conservation of native plants, pollinators, care for Indigenous artistic practices, cultures, and languages. And it's inspired by late Mi'kmaq artist Mike MacDonald. And it's studying Indigenous gardens as artwork, ecological refuge, spaces for contemplation, and sites for learning about sustenance and medicine. And so a bit more background. We know many plants and pollinator species are facing declines globally. And it's also known that plants are an important culturally component to many Indigenous nations in the Great Lakes region for well-being, medicine, and traditional food systems. So the objective of my research was to determine the role of wild pollinators to cultural keystone plant species in the Great Lakes region. So I have my 4 different chapters here. The first one was a systematic review of what is known about pollination of medicine plants in the Great Lakes region. The second chapter was determining the plant pollinator network in a culturally significant food and medicine garden. So that's looking at the Three Sisters Garden. And the third chapter is pollination of culturally significant plant Hopi tobacco. And the fourth chapter is investigating impacts of fire to ecologically and culturally significant plant common bearberry in an alvear ecosystem. So this is the first chapter, which has been published in the journal called Plants, People, and Planet. And some background for this chapter. So breeding system information is important for conservation purposes, and it helps to inform management planning. And so my objective for this chapter was to determine what is known about pollination of culturally significant medicine plants in the Great Lakes region, and what proportion of these plants have been studied, and to what degree do these plants rely on insect pollination. And so to do this, I did a literature review. I had a list of 215 plants compiled, and the plant list came from a variety of sources, including indigenous lists of culturally significant medicine plants. So I searched common name, scientific name, breeding system, etc., and collected all of the relevant articles. And I read through all of these articles and recorded all breeding system information and any known insect visitors that were recorded. And so this, there we go. This figure is showing that the count of breeding systems recorded for the 215 medicine plants, 85 of those plants reported xenogamy, so they are outcrossing, and 40 plants were autogamous. So, and overall, 50% of the plants on this list have not yet been studied in terms of breeding systems. And this is showing a breakdown of the Hymenopteran visitor categories recorded to these plants. And as you can see, Apidae is the most recorded insect visitor category. And conclusions of this chapter are that half of all culturally significant plants included in the list have yet to be studied. And so this kind of helps to navigate and guide future research on culturally significant medicine plants. And we found that most plants were outcrossing, and most commonly recorded visitors were in the Apidae family. So it seems like Apidae pollinators are critically important to these medicine plants. And my second chapter was determining the plant pollinator network in a culturally significant food and medicine garden in the Great Lakes region. And so this chapter focused on the Three Sisters Garden, which is beans, corn, and squash. So they're grown together, and the corn provides a stalk for the beans to climb up, and then the squash is grown around the bottom, and it helps to shade the soil and keep in moisture. So we had that and the addition of other medicine plants, including Monarda species and sunflower species. So understanding important pollinators in the system helps to ensure cultural well-being, and the objective was to determine the plant pollinator network in this garden. And so I also looked at comparing the diversity in the garden to nearby natural areas, which I did with using pan traps in the adjacent natural areas for these gardens. And so I created pollination networks. This is showing common visitors in the garden. This is not just bees. As you can see, there's in the first picture, there's a squash bee, and then there's a bumblebee, and then there's a hummingbird in the white circle there. And there is a monarch, and there's some lasioglossum and more squash bees. And then my plant pollinator network that I constructed was just bees. And you can see here, so the proportion of the line is showing you the frequency of the visitation that was recorded. So the most common interaction here is Xenoglossa pruinosa, so the squash bee with the patty pan squash, and also Bombus impatiens with the patty pan squash. And based on the statistics from this network, the highest pollinator service index was the squash bee. So this is showing an association between the squash bee and this culturally significant garden system. And here there's the results from the pan trap sampling, which there were 401 specimens, 22 genera, and 54 species, and the sweep netting in the gardens was 310 specimens and 37 species. 3 families were collected in the sweep netting: Apidae, Megachilidae, and Halictidae, and all 5 families were collected in the pan traps. And Halictidae was the most frequent family in the pan traps, and Apidae was the most frequent family in the sweep netting. And so this chapter found that Bombus impatiens and Xenoglossa prunosa are important visitors based on abundance and their pollinators service index. And the natural areas had a higher diversity than the garden area based on Shannon diversity. And Apidae was the most frequently recorded family compared to Halictidae in the natural areas. And the third chapter is pollination and insect visitation of a culturally significant plant, Hopi tobacco. And we published this in the end of 2022. So we looked at Hopi tobacco, the background. There's traditional, ceremonial, spiritual, social, and medicinal customs associated with this plant. So it's an extremely important plant. Culturally, it originated in South America and is now distributed across North America. And there's limited research done on the pollination of this plant, but what has been done was showing flowers open in the morning and are receptive to pollen until the following day. And the objective here was to determine the role of diurnal and nocturnal pollinators to this plant. And so a pollination experiment was conducted in 2020, and we did a bagging experiment, and we had open, closed, day open, and night open treatments. And we looked at fruit set, fruit weight, and seediness. And we also recorded insect visitation rate using video recording for the duration of blooming. And we used a generalized linear model to show that fruit weight, fruit set, and seediness all showed significance with pollination treatment. Fruit weight, open, night open, and day open are all higher than closed. Fruit set, oops, sorry. And fruit weight was the only one that was significantly different, other than closed between treatments. And figure 6 is showing the most common visitors to this plant recorded during during video recordings. And we have small bees, bumblebees, and moths. And figure 7 is showing the average insect visitation rate recorded during different times of day using the video cameras. And so late morning was significantly higher than nighttime. So Nicotiana rustica benefits from open and day open pollination, and fruit weight was higher with a day open pollination, but fruit set and seediness were unaffected. And the video recordings found small bees to be the most frequent floral visitors. And the last chapter is investigating impacts of fire on insect pollination of common bearberry in an alvear ecosystem. So we know many plants rely on insect pollination, and disturbance can impact pollination mutualisms, and disturbance can include things like fire. And bearberry is an evergreen shrub. It blooms in the early spring and is ecologically and culturally significant. So the objective here was to determine how fire impacts pollination of bearberry. We did a pilot experiment in 2020 looking at open and closed treatments. None of the closed treatments set fruit at all, while the open treatments did. And in 2023, we did a floral bagging experiment with open, closed, bumblebee pollinated, and hand cross pollinated treatments. And we looked at fruit weight, fruit set, and number of seeds per fruit. And the figure 8 is showing you the burned section on the top and the unburned section. So we did this at Burntlands Provincial Park in Eastern Ontario, and it was burned by a fire in the late 1990s, and there's a road between it that stopped the fire on one side of the road. So one side is burned and one side is not burned, and you can see the difference in the pictures there. However, bearberry occurs on both sides. So the fruit set of each pollination treatment, fruit set was 0% for the closed treatments on both unburned and burned sides, so it's not automatically self-pollinating. Bumblebee visits set fruit 60% of the time in the burned side, but 0% of the time in the unburned side. And hand cross pollination set fruit 40% of the time in the burned and 17% of the time in the unburned sections. And this is showing the number of insect visitors, and we can see that small bees are the most frequent visitor on the burned and unburned sides. And insect visitation rate was highest on the burned side compared to the unburned side. So burning may be a land management technique important to the sustainability of bearberry and its pollinator mutualism, because we can see that the bumblebees are more capable of pollinating it on the burn side. And that may be one of the potential reasons. And burning is a management technique that is considered for all of our ecosystems. However, some other things to consider are that perhaps the difference is related to plant health and nutrient availability on the different sides, with the burn side having a higher nutrient availability. And overall conclusions in future research. So from the first chapter, culturally significant plants show a high degree of reliance on insects, specifically in the Apidae family for pollination. From the second chapter, Bombus impatiens and Xenoglossa prunos are highly important to the culturally significant garden, and loss or declines of either species may significantly impact the garden network based on the pollinator service index. From the third chapter, diurnal small bee pollinators are important to Nicotiana rustica, and Nicotiana rustica was able to self-pollinate. However, fruit set, fruit weight, and seediness, it did increase with pollination. So land management around those plants, such as patches of bare soil, may provide nesting resources for important pollinator species. And lastly, bearberry was not able to set fruit without pollination in any of the treatments or on any side, burned or unburned. So they have low or no ability to self-pollinate and therefore relies on insect pollination. And with that, I would just like to say thank you to everyone who has made this research possible, and to all my committee members and lab members who have helped me along the way.